Stay tuned because I have some definitive warnings about bilge pumps that you need to know about. Most boat owners think their bilge pump is one of the safest systems on board. It's installed, it's wired, they hear it run every once in a while, and they assume that if water ever started to come in, that pump will probably save the day. That assumption is exactly why bilge pumps fail when they're needed most. The uncomfortable truth is that bilge pumps don't usually fail during normal use. They fail during neglect or corrosion or poor installation or bad assumptions. And when they do fail, they tend to fail silently until the moment water is rising and you suddenly realize you were trusting something that hasn't actually been working properly for years. One of the biggest misunderstandings starts with the pump's rating. You'll see pumps labeled at 1,500 gallons per hour, 2,000 gallons per hour, even 4,000 gallons per hour. Those numbers sound very reassuring if your boat's sinking, but they're essentially marketing fiction. They're measured in ideal lab conditions with no hose or no lift or bends and a fully charged power source. On an actual boat, once you factor in the head height, hose friction, voltage drop, and a partially discharged battery, that 2,000 gallons per hour the pump might be able to move, it's actually moving half that, sometimes even less. That wouldn't be a problem if people sized pumps conservatively, but most boats don't. Many production boats come with the smallest pump that technically satisfies regulations, not one size for a worst case scenario. Owners then assume that adding a bigger pump later solves the issue, but that often creates new problems instead. Float switches are one of the most common failure points if you've ever had one of those plastic jobs. Mechanical float switches that live in the bilge means that they live in oil and dirt and hair and debris and whatever else finds its way down there. Over time they stick or jam or corrode, or in the plastic one's case, they just stop working randomly. Electronic no moving part float switches sound better, but they have their own issues. They can false trigger from contamination, fail internally, or stop sensing altogether. What makes this worse is that most boats rely on a single automatic switch. If that switch fails, the pump will never turn on, and unless you're checking manually, you won't know it. Many owners assume that because the pump runs when they test it at the panel, that everything's fine. But that test often bypasses that switch entirely. Another quiet killer is wiring. Bilge pump wiring often runs low in the boat, stays damp, it's rarely ever looked at. Corrosion doesn't usually cause an immediate failure. Instead, it increases resistance on the circuit, which reduces voltage at the pump. That makes the pump weaker and slower right when you need it most. You can have a pump that technically still works, but moves so little water that it's effectively useless in an emergency. This is made worse by undersizing the wire. Many factory installations use wire that's barely adequate for short runs, but boats aren't lab benches like that. Long wire runs, splices, and corroded connections all add resistance to the circuit. A pump that's supposed to run at 12.6 volts might be seeing 10.5 volts or even less. And that voltage output of the pump drops dramatically. Discharge plumbing is another area where things quietly go wrong. Bilge hoses are often corrugated, which increases friction. They're sometimes run uphill longer than necessary, looped unnecessarily, or even kinked. Check valves are frequently added to prevent backflow, but many check valves restrict flow far more than the owner realizes. Worse, they can clog or fail entirely, stopping discharge. Ironically, check valves are often installed to stop a pump from cycling too often, when the real problem is poor hose routing or a poorly placed discharge. Solving one annoyance creates a much larger risk of failure. Then there's the issue of maintenance, or more accurately, the lack of maintenance. Bilge pumps are treated as install them and forget about it equipment. Owners service their winches and engines and sails and electronics, but the bilge pump is usually ignored because it's unpleasant to access and kind of out of sight, out of mind. Over time, debris accumulates around the pump base. Strainers get clogged. Did you know the bottom of the bilge pump usually comes off? It's a strainer. The pump will still spin, but water flow drops significantly. Even worse, some pumps are mounted directly on the bilge floor where they ingest the sludge, oil, and debris. Once the impeller wears out or jams, output falls off without any obvious warnings. Another misconception is that having one big pump is better than multiple smaller pumps. In reality, redundancy matters far more than raw capacity. One large pump with one switch and one discharge hose has multiple single points of failure. Two smaller pumps on independent circuits with independent switches and separate discharges dramatically improves reliability. Manual pumps deserve some mention here too. Many boats have a cockpit-mounted bilge pump that technically meets safety requirements, but in practice, ask me how I know, it's slow, exhausting to operate, and often not very well maintained. Diaphragms dry out, valves leak, hoses crack. In an emergency, relying on the manual pump that hasn't been tested in years is optimistic at best. Power supply is another weak link. Bilge pumps usually rely on the house battery bank, which may already be compromised during a flooding event. If water's entering due to a leaking shaft seal, failed hose, or hull breach, there's a good chance other systems are already affected. Low battery voltage further reduces pump output right when the demand is at its highest. This is why some boats benefit from dedicated bilge pump batteries or emergency power feeds, especially if you're going offshore. It's not about complexity, it's about removing assumptions. So what actually makes a bilge pump system reliable? First, realistic expectations. No bilge pump will save the boat from a catastrophic flooding on its own. Pumps buy you time, that's their job. But to buy time effectively, they have to work at their real world capacity, not their advertised one that it says on the box. Second, redundancy. At least two automatic pumps, preferably different switch types on different circuits, ideally with separate discharges overboard. Add a high water alarm so you're alerted before things get critical. Third, proper wiring. Tinned wire of adequate gauge, short runs where possible, heat shrink terminals, clean, well-supported connections above the normal bilge waterline. Fourth, sensible plumbing. Smooth wall hose where possible, minimal head height, no unnecessary check valves, secure runs that won't kink or collapse or get damaged. And finally, regular testing that actually tests the systems. That means lifting float switches, verifying discharge flow overboard, and checking voltage at the pump under load. If you don't see water exiting the hull, the test isn't finished. The bilge pump isn't a background system. It's one of the last lines of defense between a manageable problem and a serious emergency. Most failures aren't very dramatic. They're slow and boring and even preventable. And the reason they catch owners off guard is simple. The bilge pump usually works just well enough to create confidence, right up until the moment it doesn't. Do you have a bilge pump horror story, or maybe some best practices that you can share with the class? Let's hear it in the comments. Also, did you see this article we have called The Art of Maintaining Teak Trim on a Sailboat? Varnish, oil, or sealer? We weigh the trade-offs of longevity versus labor to help you choose the right finish for your climate and maintenance schedule. A great read here. I'll leave a link in the description for you. If you like sailboat videos, hit the thumbs up on this one. It really helps us out, but also lets YouTube know that you're into this stuff, so it'll show you more of it. And hit subscribe so that I can see you again next time.